Hi, my name's Allison Musselman. Welcome to Ethics. Today we're going to be talking about end-of-life dilemmas. It's a pretty sensitive subject, I would say. Most families have a pretty hard time dealing with situations where they're in a painful situation, where they have a family member that is terminally ill or a family member in a vegetative state. I feel like this topic creates a lot of emotion, a lot of heat, a lot of controversy. One thing about end-of-life dilemmas, one thing that is common is a physician is to put a patient on ventilator or antibiotics that help extend a patient's life. However, issues arise when you are living in a certain state and they have laws that go against a definition of death, or your patient is not in what this state law considers a definition of death. And issues also arise whenever there is controversy on who's allowed to make certain decisions. If a patient is in a vegetative state and there's no living will, families have a lot of issues when it comes to that sort of thing. Families also don't always agree with each other, right? So a lot of times families will disagree over who maybe the patient put in charge of making hard and big decisions like that. Maybe the brother thinks that it should be him and the sister got put in charge, but the sister doesn't have her life together, so the brother has issues with that. There's all sorts of, there's millions of scenarios that go wrong or cause a family feud in situations like this because it's so painful and hard. And of course, families want to make the right decision. They want to make the decision that they think that their family member would want to live with. One thing about end-of-life dilemmas that is always hard to even think about, if a family is in this, like the circumstance of having someone in a vegetative state, is we do hear about the miracles that happen, and the child who was not supposed to wake up, but he or she did, and physicians don't really have an explanation for this. They already might have said that they're going to continue on an ongoing vegetative state, and there's really no hope and no reason to ever believe that they would come out of a coma or ever be off of life support. And the crazy part is that it does happen, and doctors aren't really sure why, but it does just kind of happen. There's a word that our book talks about in the chapter that talks about end-of-life dilemmas. It's called euthanasia, and it is defined as the mercy killing of hopelessly ill, injured, or incapacitated humans. A long time ago, like way before the 1800s, there were religions and the practice of killing people because they were terminally ill or were seriously injured and were never going to live a life to the fullest, or so they thought. One example of this is the Buddhist religion. Suicide was completely acceptable. This was not something that was deemed something crazy to do or against religious views as it's commonly seen now. Another example of this is the Celtics. They thought that even if a person did not agree to suicide because they were terminally ill or severely injured, they thought that that person was going to go to hell because they weren't going to commit suicide because of their illness or whatever they might have had. And that was a long time ago. That was the belief way back when, and around 1800s is when physicians started saying, this is kind of crazy. Why is this the belief? We're taking an oath to protect people and to make people healthy, and we don't want to continue the tradition or the religious view or whatever the group that they were associated with, they didn't want to continue that, so they started telling people no. Like, no, I will not, which nowadays we can relate it to the idea of a physician-assisted suicide. And our society now has heard that a couple times, in a couple circumstances that has been on the news, where a family wants a physician-assisted suicide, and whether it's legal, not legal, is it ethical, is it not ethical, is it going against all of what a physician stands for, those kinds of things. But it used to be common practice, and then physicians decided, no way, man, like I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to treat people regardless of their circumstance, because that's my job as a doctor. So that was really interesting to think that. But another couple definitions. It can kind of be separated into active and passive. Active is commonly known as the intentional act of providing a patient with a dose of medication that will kill them, similar to death parole. So when someone in prison is killed, that's how they kill them, is with a lethal dose of medication, and it kills them pretty much instantly. The opposite of that is passive. It's when a life-saving treatment like a ventilator or certain antibiotics or whatever it might be that's helping the patient live is completely stopped, and then after a certain period of time, whether it's a day or a week, a couple days, whatever it might be, based off of the illness, they have a natural death. Voluntary happens when someone who is very ill makes the choice to die, so they are not in a vegetative state, or they have a living will that says they don't want to live off a full life on ventilators. That's not a full life to them. And involuntary is when the decision to end life is, for someone who's terminally ill, is made by someone else. So that would be a family member who is deemed the guardian of whoever it might be that's very ill, or is unable or never going to be awake again, or didn't have a living will or whatever, to make that decision on their own. So what are the morals here? What is right? What is wrong? What are the arguments? Questions that families usually struggle with are questions that in our book Nash says to ask ourselves. It reminds me of the second language, and should they withhold care? Should they withdraw the care from their loved one that's keeping them alive but not in a living state where they're actually out in the world living? What should be the determining factor on their decision? Is it because the person who's terminally ill or who is in a vegetative state would or wouldn't want to live this way, or is it because the family doesn't want to let go out of grief? And what is the definition of when someone dies? Is vegetative state where they'll never have a life, they'll never be able to do anything ever again on their own, they have no brain function, or they have no body, whatever it might be, is that a real definition of death? And certain people would say yes, and certain people would say no. Some important considerations that are always brought into this sort of painful situation, if a family is going through this, if there is a family will, there's a living will that the patient has specifically shown, this is what my wants are, this is what I want for my life, and the family member or a friend is legally deemed to serve as a legal guardian to make these sort of big decisions. A couple statistics about this. About 2 million Americans die each year, and 80% of those die in nursing homes, and 70% choose to forego life support. So they either have a written will or something like that that says they don't want to live in a vegetative state for longer than a certain period of time, because that's their wish. And then legally, every sane and able person above the age of 18 has the right to determine what they'd like to do with their own body. So anyone who's legally an adult can have a living will that says their wishes and whether they want to continue life on life support or whether they don't, those kind of things. So in 2013, there was something called the Belgium law, and it was legal for people over the age of 18 to say, hey, actually, I don't want to live anymore because I'm going through this terrible disease. So then the government started considering to making it legal for children. No other country has ever done this, and advocates thought that this was a great idea. They said, you know what, families can get together and the parents and the child can make the decision to forego life and either take them off of life support or, allow them to make their own decision to live or to die. And of course, the opponents, they weren't sure that children were able or capable to understand the responsibility of the decision to end their own life. So they didn't feel that a child was in the right mind to be able to say, hey, I don't want to live anymore, because they didn't really think that a child would understand that. Another case very different from this was back in 1983 in Missouri. A woman named Nancy, she was left in a vegetative state due to a tragic car accident. The family could not order the physicians to remove the artificial nutrition that was keeping her alive because under state law in Missouri, she was not technically what they considered dead. So they had to leave her on the life support until further notice. So the family went to court, and it took them about 7 years to finally get a court ruling to allow the physicians to remove her feeding tube and allow Nancy to have a peaceful death like the family had wished. So a lot of ethical tension arises with this sort of topic. Different states have all sort of different laws. There's federal laws that are different than state laws. And so a lot of times families don't understand why a law is this different than the federal law. And of course there's tension in all the families because who's correct, right? So who is able to say, yes, we can take them off of life support when there was no will, when the person didn't ever say, yes, I want to not live this way. And then is the physician making the right call in regards to treatment? A lot of families don't think so. They're like, no, like they might wake up, or no, they'll never wake up, or whatever the situation might be. Like there's a lot of tension that arises with this. So talking about moral language and putting this all back into what we've learned in the books that we've been reading all semester, Nash's first language, most people have a very strong response to this ethical dilemma. They have a very strong first reaction. There's a lot of sides to consider, and there's a lot of answers, there's a lot of questions that should be answered and need to be defined to analyze this dilemma. And Nash's second law emphasizes the importance to ask all of ourselves enough questions to really fully understand each side so that we can that kind of falls into Nash's third language, and that allows us to come to a final decision based off of all of the answers from the questions that we've answered, and to allow us to come to whatever conclusion that we think is morally correct or morally wrong. And individually, it's very easy to come up with a conclusion of moral belief about an end-all dilemma, right? So you think of a certain situation and you're like, yeah, this is exactly what I would do. But collectively, as a society or a community, it's much more difficult because we all have different morals, and we're not all going to agree. So that's where states and federal laws have problems, because one state says this, but a different state says something else, and it's just very hard for everyone to agree. And so I think that our society should be flexible. I think that families should be allowed to make their own decision. I think that it should be pushed that, if you're over the age of 18, you should probably have a will of some kind. Somewhere it says, hey, this is what I want. This is, I do or I don't want to be on a ventilator for the rest of my life. God forbid something terrible happens to me. I think that each state should really look at this issue and try to make a decision that allows everyone to have maybe peace, I guess, with this issue. And because families are grieving when they're in a situation like this. And so it's hard to say who is correct and who's wrong, but I think that states should do a better job of trying to really be sensitive to this topic.